Welcome to another guide on how to make mods for the game Space Engineers. This is a big one. This is the custom character tutorial. You can make a lot here, and I've done a few over my time. You can have different classes of characters, different faces just to differentiate between your friends, or characters for a story, NPCs to fit into mods. What I'm going to go through in this video here is how to create your own playable character. So that's a character that you'll actually be able to play with as yourself or with friends. To make a playable character, it's highly recommended that you look to start with the Keen skeleton and go through and use a custom skeleton, but then you'll have to commit to remaking all the animations and jumping through a bunch of hoops. It's just generally faster to go with Keen's skeleton directly. Fortunately, they provide it directly in the SDK. So to import it, just initialize the scene in the same way. Go down to import FBX like you would any other. Then in the SDK, in content, models, characters, astronaut, you've got the male and female skeletons available. Simply import, and you'll notice that your scene type has changed directly to character, and we no longer have collections for build states and quite so many LOD states, as this is all we need for a standard character. So here's our default astronaut in all his glory. Now, if you're not going to use the standard mesh for anything, then you can simply delete. You'll see the animated parts are separate meshes. So we have a helmet piece and we have a separate piece for the head, which also contains the eyes. And that just leaves behind the skeleton. Now, there's a couple of rules for using the Keen's skeleton. Don't move the bones. Don't go into edit mode and adjust the position of any of the bones in order to best fit your custom mesh. You have to make the mesh fit the bones. And don't change the names of any of the bones for the same reason as the mesh. The name of the parts are specific for the animation system to work. Now, if your model does differ from the default astronaut dramatically, I would recommend creating additional new bones, and then you'll be able to create a layered animation which will allow you to manipulate those new bones as part of the animation controller. Quite a complicated issue, so something that I will go through in a separate video. First thing we're going to do is we're going to make a modification to the existing standard character. Now, one of the basic principles that you'll need to know about in order to actually progress with making a custom character is the concept of weight painting. As I go through different parts of the character, the different bones that I'm selecting here are associated with different parts of the mesh. And this is a weighting represented by this color gradient. The more towards the red, the more that bone has an effect over the mesh. The more towards the blue, the less the bone has an effect on the mesh. We're not going to go through too much detail there, but if you're interested, I recommend looking it up. There's probably hundreds of different tutorials and a wealth of information. You'll likely find one that's best suited for you. But the little modification we're going to make here is we're going to create this second screen on the other arm, so we end up with a purely mirrored character. So let's get rid of the one we have here. And the way I'm going to make this modification is a bit of a quick trick. Go into edit mode, select these bits, Going to duplicate them, separate them from the main mesh, back into object mode. Now I've got my separated mesh. You'll see it still has the armature modifier. I'm going to add a mirror. Then I'm going to apply it back into edit mode. And just delete that. And now we have one on the other side. If we take our armature and we go into pose mode, and we select one of our arm bones here, we'll see that screen is still parented to the other side. What we're going to do is find the vertex group that contains weighting information for that left arm. Here we go. Left forearm 2. And I'm just going to rename it right forearm 2. Now, if I go into pose mode, no longer associated with that arm, are associated with that arm in exactly the same way. For a basic setup, just need to take a copy of the vanilla character SBC and change just a few lines. For my example here, I've given a custom subtype and a custom name. I like to try and match these as close as possible. For some parts, when you get to doing non-playable characters, they use the name field rather than the subtype field. And then the model here. So in this case, my model is just the example character screen, and it's just in the folder models characters. I'm not going to change anything else here, but we have quite a lot that we can change. So depending upon how your character is, if there's perhaps a different footprint that you want to put in, you can specify the footprint decals. Here you can switch off the ragdoll if you've not used the ragdoll, and the inventory spawn component. So the inventory spawn component is the dropped bag. When your character dies, the inventory they're carrying gets dropped into the loot bag. The inventory size, how long the body is left for looting if you're not using the dropped bag. You can force the character to only use walking. There's a number of variables here about walking speed, slope, jump force. This section here is for the collision size. The elements commented out here will default if they're not present. And these parts, again, I can't stress enough about not changing the names of things. But here where we have specifically named parts of the skeleton, so for some reason, if you've changed the end of one of the hand bones, you may be able to respecify it here, but that will have other effects later on. This section is interesting. So if you have alternate locations for the headlights, you can specify them here. You can give us a different offset for where that light is based upon the location of the dummy. This doesn't have to be a dummy. It can also be a bone or some other part of the skeleton structure. These fields here will disable a material by name when you're in first person. So what this does is it means you don't see through the back of the head of the engineer when you're inside a cockpit. Oxygen consumption, hydrogen levels, these are pretty self-explanatory. Suit resources, here the suit consumption in extreme temperatures. So when the temperature is freeze or inferno, this variable will make your suit consume higher rates of power. Jetpack dummies. So the standard engineer, you just have two, one on the front, one on the back, but you can have multiple of these. Having the multiple dummies in different directions doesn't actually change how the force is applied, but is as a visual thing. If you happen to have a different jetpack arrangement, you can use this. And then this is the section that deals with how the jetpack operates, its force and slowdown, flame colors, flame texture materials. These are the bone sets. So this is to do with how the animations can apply to different masked bone settings. So here where we have left hand, where the left hand animation set is in the animation controller, it affects all of these bones. There is some information here about level of detail bones and weak point indices. So what this is the bone set low down here in the ragdoll mappings that take more damage when impacted by projectile. So here, bone set indice number 2, so 0, 1, 2. So this is the rib cage and neck part of the skeleton, so that will be for headshots. And then 15 and 16 low down will be other points in the skeleton where it's considered that you would take more damage from projectiles. You don't want to change any of this. It all is rather dependent on staying as is. A lot of this has been worked out by the dev team, work best with the animation sets. We have a lot of animations here that can be modified, but this takes a backseat to the animation controller, so where we would have to create additional animation layers anyway. Sound definitions is an area where you can make changes quite easily. You can have specific sounds for choking, for getting hit with projectiles, or even the sound that the player hears when the ship is traveling fast. Right down at the bottom here, we've got server offsets. So this is to do with how turrets affect the player. So if you have got a severely modified player, you may need to change how that offset is for being targeted by turrets. But for our purposes, all we need to do is create a new subtype, a new name, and a new model identifier. The other file that we need to have is an entity container. This is my example. The entity containers file is quite long, but here I've stripped out all the unnecessary parts, and I've created an entity container for my character. What this does is it points the entity components at your character and allows them to have things like stats, target locking, the survival buffs. As we're not making a custom stat for this, I've left everything as default. So here we have default astronaut, character target locking, and just all the default survival buffs. So with those files done, we can go into our little testing world. Here I am just with a default engineer. To check our skin works, I'm into the suit change section of the med bay, and from this drop down we should be able to choose from our other types. As I'm in a creative world, I have access to the animals, and just ignore the example alien. We'll get to him in a little bit. I'm just going to choose here our example character screen, and here you see our character has loaded up with the two screens, and it looks like it's working as I jostle him around in the med bay here. Just change colors, that's all working, so the standard textures apply. Because we've used the default textures, any suit modifications will also work, as these are based upon the material names. So if you change the name of the material, even if you keep the textures the same, you can break that connection, which allows you to put skins on your character. Here he is, our default engineer with two screens. So, say you want to do something completely new. You can absolutely do that. You're just rather constrained by the proportions of the default skeleton. So I'm just going to quickly mock up now a rough alien creature, and we'll get that attached to the default skeleton and see how that comes out in the game. our little alien creature friend. I just grabbed some random materials from the asset library here. I've used an alien ice for the skin, cloth for the legs, and red fabric texture for the main body here. You just have to have more than one material when your mesh is the whole character. And as such, I've sort of divided up a couple of the bits here in order to be able to provide them material. Head, left and right hands. As you saw, all I did, a bit of a cheat, I just applied parenting with default weights, as I'm not a particularly complicated character. It should be good enough for initial testing, so a little bit of a wiggle. And then we can export. Now, in a little bit of something I didn't do on the simple edit is I didn't provide any external collision file. Characters, what you can do is you can use the existing ragdoll collision file for your character, and this will allow them to interact in the same way when they die as the standard astronaut. So just by going in there, providing the SE astronaut HKT for the female version, if you're making a character using the female animation controller, and we can specify that as an external file, and that will be copied into our mod export locate. And then you should be able to export currency. If your character is more complex and you have some issues with the weight painting, so I am just going to try and break my weight painting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add that's a bit big, a little cube here as a portion of this hand, but I'm not going to weight paint it. Oh, a little bit funny because I've got a decimate modifier just to the polys. If I go to export this now, I will get, flash it very briefly there, an error. Left arm has invalid weight paint. Vertex not grouped in a vertex group. And so, because I've subdivided my character, I'm able to see which piece of mesh is causing me the problem, left arm. And if I go to the data, I now have two new vertex groups. The ungrouped vertex and the unweighted. So anything that is contained that is not part of a vertex group and therefore not weighted at all would be selected here, and anything that is part of a group but isn't part of the weighting solution, it has a 0 value for weight, you will also be able to select those vertex. So because this cube comes under both categories, it will exist in both groups. So when you've identified which bit of your model is the problem, you can find the relevant group. So I'm add this into the left hand group, and then I will remove those two vertex groups. And when I export now, we should have no errors. For the sake of this test, I'm just going to delete cube and run. Still no errors, which is fantastic. For character But you do have an additional option here, which is rotate character. Now this is to provide the change in Keen's models where there is 180-degree rotation on all components. If you're working on a animal creature, you're going to want to turn that off. But for the playable characters, leave this on. Just the same as our astronaut example, all I've really changed here is I've changed the subtype, the name and the model location, and I've given it the entity container with a subtype that matches. Everything here is set for default astronaut, but if you want to create a character, say for instance you've created an armored soldier, you may want to give them a higher level of hit points. Then you can look in the stat SBC file, and here you'll find the health values for all creatures and characters, even the radiation amounts, food stats, and how certain buffs may implement these. So here we are back in our little test environment. And so we're just going to go back into the wardrobe of the medical bay and select our alien character. Here he is. Now, because his stature is somewhat taller than the standard engineer, he sticks out the top. But because there's no change to the collision, he actually fits in quite nicely. And here we go, working as intended. Now, because I've been around here and I've looked at some of these things before, my character doesn't have the eye bones, but if I had included the eye bones, there is a chance that the eyelash blinking animation would be playing here and causing some deformation. I have included the helmet, so if you just saw that, opening and closing the helmet actually creates a little motion in his neck. But because I've tried to maintain most of the proportions, if I grab a rifle, he sort of holds the rifle as the standard engineer would. We've got first person, but a number of the animations will now play for the most part as a vanilla character without having to do all those complicated animations. This might be only a basic character, but really it's the same procedure. Everything comes down to weight painting and understanding of which bones control which parts of the vanilla character. I hope you've been able to follow along with me this far. It's been quite a brief overview of the character makeup in Space Engineers that you should be able to now create your own custom characters to play with in-game. Thanks for watching.